Good morning to the DME for Peace community, and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. These M&E Thursday Talks on DME for Peace are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. Just in case you've forgotten, my name is Jack Farrell, and I am the DME for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground, based in the extremely windy but still beautiful Washington, D.C. Today, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Michael Quinn Patton, who is joining us to lead a discussion on principles-focused evaluation. And a special note about our format today, we're going to have a 1-hour webinar as opposed to our usual 45 minutes, which will allow Michael to speak for 30 minutes. And once Michael has finished his presentation, we'll jump right into a question and answer session. And as a reminder, you can ask your questions in advance of the discussion portion by submitting them through the question function on GoToWebinar throughout the presentation. I'm now going to hand this over to Michael to get us underway. Michael, it's great to have you back on the Thursday Talks, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Jack, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to get this opportunity to introduce you to principles-focused evaluation. You're looking at the cover of my new book that came out late last year on this topic, and featured on the cover is an inukshuk. These are long, large stone cairns in the northern part of Canada and the Yukon area that are established and put up to guide people through the wilderness of the tundra, in a place where food is sometimes put, sacred objects are put, but in storms and in the winter, they provide guidance to navigate the extreme wilderness of the northern continent. And that's the symbol, in a way, for principles. Principles provide guidance for navigating complexity. And that's the basis then for both articulating principles and evaluating them. In his book on the tyranny of experts, Bill Easterly opens by saying it is critical to get the principles of action right before acting. Easterly's book is controversial about development, but that statement is not, from my perspective. I think it is accurate. It is critical to get the principles of action right before acting. And those principles, the basic premise here is that principles can be evaluated. Nelson Mandela, a man of principles, said you mustn't compromise your principles, but you mustn't humiliate the opposition. No one is more dangerous than one who is humiliated. And after getting out of prison and becoming president of South Africa with Bishop Tutu, they created the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa based upon 5 principles in sequence: bringing together the oppressor and the oppressed, speaking the truth to each other, confession, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Mandela was often asked how he could forgive the nearly 20 years of his life that was taken from him, the torture and abuse. And his response was always, you don't begin with forgiveness. You have to begin by bringing the oppressor and the oppressed together, speaking truth to each other. The oppressor confesses, and only then does forgiveness and reconciliation follow. So one form of principles is a sequence of principles. The Canadian government has apologized for their treatment of First Nations Aboriginal people in residence schools where they were taken from their families and communities for nearly 100 years in Canada. And they've been through a peace and reconciliation process. And the Canadian Evaluation Society has adopted as their policy platform for the current and foreseeable future, working on the reconciliation action items that have come out of that process. Of course, Rwanda has a peace and reconciliation process, and each of these places, the principles are slightly different. And the ways in which they operate are different, and that gives a distinct national and cultural, political flavor to each setting. I did a book with 2 Canadian colleagues called getting to maybe how the world has changed, in which we looked at social movements. And we found that social movements that began, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving and Muhammad Yunus's microfinance movement, didn't begin with strategic plans or logic models. They began with a deep sense that something was wrong, that the way things were was not right. And they began engaging the problem that they wanted to deal with from a principles perspective. Social movements are principles driven, first and foremost. And eventually they may become institutionalized and organized, as Mothers Against Drunk Driving did, and as aspects of microfinance have. But the issue remains the way in which that institutionalization and organization still reflects or not founding principles. We, on yesterday, commemorated the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, and his overarching principle of nonviolence was often disputed within the civil rights movement by people in the movement who wanted to respond in kind against the brutality and oppression and violence that they experienced. Um, and he held fast that nonviolence had to be an absolute principle, as did Mahatma Gandhi. And so these are examples of highly principled people who are acting on principle. And the point of principles-focused evaluation, as we get into more concrete and contemporary examples, is that principles can be evaluated, but are a different kind of evaluation and a different kind of evaluand, the focus of evaluation, the jargon we use for the thing evaluated. They're different than projects and programs. So principle-focused evaluation questions ask, to what extent is the principle or principles meaningful to those to whom it is meant to provide guidance? To what extent is the principle adhered to? And if adhered to, in what ways and to what extent does it or the set of principles lead toward desired results? So principles are not just about process. Principles are also directed towards outcome. The principle of nonviolence is both a way of engaging the world, but is embedded in that principle a kind of society in which people interact with each other out of mutual respect and a sense of equity and without resorting to violence as an outcome. The niche of principles-focused evaluation then is that it treats principles as the evaluand, the unit of analysis. It can be an approach to programming. It's a way to navigate complex dynamic systems. And where principles are providing guidance, it becomes an approach to evaluation. We're talking then about effectiveness principles. An effectiveness principle is a statement that provides guidance about how to think or behave towards some desired result, either explicit or implicit, based on norms, values, beliefs, experience, and knowledge. The statement is a hypothesis until evaluated within some context. That is, the effectiveness of the principle is a hypothesis until evaluated within some context to determine its relative meaningfulness, truth, feasibility, and utility for those attempting to or committed to following it. I find it's helpful to distinguish rules of engagement from principles of engagement as simply one way to help get a sense of what we're talking about with principles. So in driving, a rule is a stop sign. You're not supposed to do a rolling stop. You're supposed to come to a complete stop and look both ways. A principle is defensive driving, and it illustrates the nature of principles. They provide guidance, but not detailed prescription. They have to be interpreted in context. Defensive driving says, pay attention, adjust your driving to road conditions, to weather conditions. So as Jack said, it is windy in DC today. If you're out on a highway with high winds, you have to adjust to those high winds and to the possible visibility that may come as it is. I'm coming to you from Minnesota, where we have both high winds and snow, and that affects visibility on the road. Adjust yourself to the amount of traffic. Don't be distracted while driving by talking on mobile devices. And so defensive driving provides guidance, but must be interpreted in context. Another characteristic of principles is that you can identify an alternative or opposite principle. Defensive driving is contrasted with driving without paying attention, driving in a distracted fashion. Recipes are a form of rules. So a recipe would prescribe to add a quarter teaspoon of salt in order to get the exact same result every time you do the recipe, which is the purpose of recipes. A principle of cooking, in contrast, is to season to taste and situation. Who's coming? What are their health issues? What kind of food would go well with what kind of seasoning? What's fresh in the marketplace? And so season to taste and situation is a principle. Add a quarter teaspoon of salt is a rule. And in the program world, rules are best practices. They're highly prescriptive. They tell you exactly what to do. Principles, again, provide guidance, but have to be adapted to context. In virtually every field of endeavor, you'll find both rules and principles. So in the field of exercise, there are various kinds of rules, one of which put forth is to do 30 minutes of aerobic exercise each day. A principle, in contrast, is to exercise regularly at a level that supports health and is sustainable given your health, lifestyle, age, and capacity. We recently had an example of a rule becoming a principle. The American Academy of Pediatrics in 1999 formulated the rule, no screens under 2. Now at that time, the only screens were television and computer screens, not all the screens we have today. Last December, they reformulated the rule based upon research and evaluation to a principle. And the new principle is no screens under 2 without interaction. That is, the issue was not the screens. The issue was using the screens for babysitting. But no screens with under 2 without interaction means that interaction has to be based upon the age of the child. Interacting with an 8-month-old, a 2-year-old is going to be different. How many children are present, what adults are present, what the cultural traditions for interaction are, and what's on the screen. But the guidance it provides is to interact with young children around whatever devices they're looking at with you, not to just put them in front of the screens as babysitting. An evaluation, a rule is to deliver the report on time, the date specified in the contract. A utilization-focused principle, in contrast, is to target delivery of findings to be timely and useful for informing decisions and learning opportunities, monitor situational developments that may affect timeliness. So if you're evaluating rules, the only issue is whether or not people are complying with them. But as I said, if you're evaluating principles, you're looking for their meaningfulness and relevance to the people who are supposed to follow them. You're looking for the degree of adherence to the principles and the results of following the principles. So to help in developing principles, because just as evaluators got involved in the business of what constitutes a good goal, and we help programs articulate SMART goals, goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And so evaluation moved from being a back-end activity of measuring goal attainment to a front-end activity of helping formulate goals. We do the same with principles. They don't come ready for evaluation. And so in the book, I've offered the guide framework for principles, which specify 5 criteria for a principle. The first, that it actually provides guidance. The second is that it is useful. So in providing guidance, it's directional, it's emphatic, it's distinctive from an opposite or alternative principle. It's useful in that it points toward desired results, describes how to be effective. A principle should support making choices and decisions. The utility resides in being interpretable, doable, feasible, and actionable. Principles are inspiring. They're values-based, ethically grounded, meaningful to people. They evoke a sense of purpose. A value is a statement of belief. It becomes a principle when a verb is added to it that makes it behavioral. Principles are behavioral. Values are belief-based. And so values themselves are not always actionable until they are stated in a principled form. The fourth of the 5 criteria is developmental. A principle is context sensitive, complexity adaptable, and enduring, not time bound. SMART goals expire. They have time frames on them. Principles are enduring. And finally, that principles are evaluable. Can judge the extent to which they're followed, what results from following them, if they take you where you want to go. So with those criteria in mind, let's look at some examples of principles and principles-focused evaluation. One of the most global examples was the evaluation of the Paris Declaration on international aid. This is not the climate change agreement, but the Paris Declaration on International Development Aid that was signed in 2005 by the donor countries, the recipient partner countries, and international agencies to change the way that international aid is done. The Paris Declaration principles came out of a long series of high-level forums and conferences dating back to the 1980s that culminated in the Paris Declaration around 5 principles: that countries, that international development aid should be based upon country priorities, that donors should align their donor giving with country priorities, that donors should harmonize among themselves and with each other in alignment with country priorities, that there should be mutual accountability and managing for results. And in each of these Paris Declaration principles, there is an implied baseline against which these represent major paradigm shifts in how international aid would be done. So the principle of country ownership calls for a change from international development aid being based upon donor priorities, not country priorities. Alignment with country priorities, again, would represent a major shift away from international development aid in which donor countries align their aid with their own national security and interests rather than with those of the recipient countries. Harmonization is against the baseline of development aid donors and agencies each doing their own thing with their own priorities and their own strategies, rather than collaborating together around recipient country priorities. Mutual accountability represents a change from one-way accountability, where recipient countries are accountable to donors, but donors were not accountable to recipients. And management for results calls for a shift from managing around money flows and activities. So these 5 principles in combination constituted a major potential paradigm shift for international development aid. There's no agency or initiative charged with implementing the Paris Declaration principles. Each country and each international agency that was signatory to the Paris Declaration principles would be responsible for their own implementation. But the signing of the Paris Declaration did include a mandate that they be evaluated. And the Scandinavian countries took the leadership in generating an independent commission to carry out the evaluation of the implementation of the Paris Declaration principles. That evaluation involved case studies in 22 countries, displayed here in blue, and 18 international donor countries, examining the extent to which they were complying with the Paris Declaration principles. The international evaluation team was led by Bernard Wood from Canada, with evaluation participants from the different continents of the world, and they created and supported national evaluation teams. The selection of those teams were done according to the Paris Declaration principles, with country reports on each of the participating countries, 22 countries, and then they would go in and interview key informants, ministry officials, people involved in international projects. They would look at documentation, and they would assess the extent to which the Paris Declaration principles were actually being adhered to. They used three overarching metrics for evaluating implementation of the Paris Declaration principles: how far a particular country or agency had gone in implementing the principles, what direction they were taking. Were they actually going in the desired direction? And at what speed were they moving in implementing the Paris Declaration principles? Distance, direction, and speed. The findings, produced just in time for the Busan High-Level Forum in 2011, Busan, Korea, in December of 2011, found that country ownership had advanced farthest, alignment and harmonization improved unevenly, mutual accountability and managing for results lagged the most, and the report recommended that action on mutual accountability was the most important need, backed by transparency and a realistic acceptance and management of risk. The Paris Declaration evaluation had a high degree of what we call process use, that is, the effects on those involved in the evaluation of being involved in the evaluation. So as national evaluation teams went out and interviewed key informants about the extent to which their international development activities followed the Paris Declaration principles, those key informants would typically say, and you're here to evaluate what? And they would explain the Paris Declaration principles. And they'd say, and my country or my agency signed on to those? And they'd say, yes, they did. And the evaluators had to carry with them a one-page sheet explaining the 5 Paris Declaration principles. And then those being interviewed would say, all right, that's news to me, but come back in a month and we'll tell you what we're doing about them. This is what we call process use, the impact of an evaluation taking place, and the fact that the principles were being evaluated had a major impact upon those countries and agencies that participated in the case studies, because they were actually then paying attention to the principles. A version of what gets measured gets done, what gets evaluated gets done. All of the documentation, the 22 case studies, the 18 agency case studies, the final overall synthesis report is available at the OECD website in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. There are videos. This evaluation won the American Evaluation Association Outstanding Evaluation of the Year in 2012, both because of its comprehensiveness and utilization focused, but the exemplary efforts that went into making the data and the reports available and accessible. Major management books that have an influence are often principles-based. Jim Collins and his team are probably the most influential private sector management consultants these days. Collins' book, Good to Great, remains a bestseller on how companies can move to greatness. His book on Built to Last is about companies that are sustainable. He came out with a book in 2012 called Great by Choice, comparing companies that went under during the 2008 financial crisis and those that thrived in that crisis, called Great by Choice. And in each of those books, he identifies principles of effectiveness. Not prescriptions, not best practices, but principles. The Global Alliance for the Future of Food is an alliance of 20 philanthropic foundations that have come together to work on international agriculture transformation and food systems transformation. And they have come together to hold international dialogues. Last year in France, they held an international dialogue on the future of food and a changing climate. 280 participants, 185 organizations, 42 countries. I participated as an evaluator. And they have come together around a set of principles. Each of their foundations had their own mission, had their own values, had their own ways of operating, had their own strategic plans. And as they came together, they found that they could identify a core set of principles that they agreed on that was not in conflict with any of their individual foundation values. And that allowed them to come together and become a principles-focused alliance. Their principles are to attend to renewability. I'm not going to take the time to read each of these statements. It's all on their website. Resilience, support regenerative, durable, and economically adaptive systems. Equity, diversity, value our rich and diverse agricultural, ecological, and cultural heritage. Healthfulness, advancing the health and well-being of people, and seeing things as interconnected. The United Nations on World Humanitarian Day last fall put forward 4 principles for humanitarian assistance. And again, these are available. This is an example of the kinds of statements that are often formulated and that in this case don't quite meet the guide criteria very explicitly. One of the exercises I do in workshops around principles is have participants take these 4 humanitarian principles and rework them from an evaluability perspective. And that provides an interesting exercise. Finally, in the sustainability development goals arena, we've been doing some work on what we're calling blue marble evaluation. And blue marble principles are looking at the international development from a blue marble perspective, using blue marble principles for both action and evaluation. And I'll give you a couple of examples of those. One principle is a global scale principle to target change globally, meaning that the unit of analysis targeted for global systems change should be a global system. The terms international and multinational refer to working in several countries. In contrast, global involves working throughout the world to change the nature and dynamics of a global system. We find that a lot of initiatives that call themselves global are working in 3 countries on one issue. The fidelity piece then of a blue marble evaluation principle is the global fidelity principle would assess the extent and ways in which an intervention or initiative is truly global. A cross-sector principle involves integrating and coordinating interventions across sectors and traditional program areas. Blue marble interventions work across sectors, and again, the evaluation of this is to assess the extent to which an initiative addresses multiple interrelated factors across silos, indeed across SDGs, looks at interconnections rather than just within the silos, looks at the system dynamics of those interrelationships and the interconnections among SDGs as a matter of principle. A global-local dynamic interconnection principle looks at the connections between global and local perspectives. This global-local interaction then, and the nature of that, is something that can be examined from the perspective of a principle. And let me just skip to one final piece here as before I open up for questions. In October of 2017, President Xi of the People's Republic of China subsequently designated China's thought leader, the first so designated since Mao Zedong, in a 5-hour speech, laid out the overarching principle of China's future and relationship with the world of creating and sustaining socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And in that speech, he identified 14 specific principles that would guide both China and their interactions with the world. it's a nice example of a place where once you start looking for principles, they turn up all in all kinds of places. And as you hopefully can see, principles are different from projects or programs in what they represent, in what the implementation challenges are, as well as in what the evaluation challenges are. So let me stop there, Jack, hopefully giving people a sense of what the issues are and see what kind of issues are emerging for folks.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. You have given us a lot to think about, and the questions are already flowing in. But just before we start the Q&A, a couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question one of two ways. The first way you can submit a question is through the question function on GoToWebinar. The second is to click on the hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask you to submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, the talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace, so that those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion and learn from our wider engagement. Our first question comes from Lenore Bajare Dukes, and Lenore says, hello and thank you for this helpful webinar. Do you have examples of people who are engaged in social movements using principles-focused evaluation themselves, perhaps with help to set movement strategy?
Well, the example that I use most prominently is the nonviolence movements of Mahatma Gandhi and for overturning colonialism, and the movement of the civil rights movement, which was very principles based. A recent example that I found quite striking is the Native Americans on Standing Rock Reservation in the United States are fighting an oil pipeline that is being proposed to be put right through reservation lands and around the reservation in ways that might threaten the environment. And a number of people involved in the social movement of trying to stop fossil fuels in general and to stop these pipelines that threaten environmentally have joined efforts with Standing Rock to oppose that pipeline. I had a colleague who went out to be a part of the protests out there, and she told me that on the wall of the kitchen where people were being fed was a list of 4 or 5 principles, and you can actually Google these, the Standing Rock protest principles, that are stated in more diplomatic terms apparently online than they were in the kitchen. But basically, one of the principles was don't offer us advice. We've already heard it. We know what we're doing. And what that suggests is that all kinds of do-gooder, middle-class white folks, liberals and progressives going out to help the Native Americans, and are going to show up and tell them what they ought to do. And so that principle makes it clear that the Native American leaders are in charge of the protests. They will set the agenda. They welcome support from people, but they're not asking for advice about how they ought to go about it. That frames the set of interactions. A second principle was do what you are asked to do. And that means that most of what people are going to be asked to do are menial tasks. They're going to be asked to do cleanup and cooking and deal with supplies. A third principle was that when to be prepared to be arrested. And if you're not prepared to be arrested, don't come. And a fourth principle is something like your position when things get heavy is to be between us and the police. So those are quite concrete principles that within the context of a larger social movement help direct the relationships between outsiders who want to come to a movement and support it and the people who live in the area where the movement is going on. It's an example of a principle that say who's really guiding things here, who's in charge, what's the leadership, and to get the roles clear in a social movement, which is often an issue for social movements.
Thank you, Michael. Our next question comes from Serge Eric Yaku Dijam. Serge, I see you've got your hand raised, so we're going to try to unmute your microphone. Special shout out to Serge, as he is a current participant and mentor on DME for Peace's global mentorship program. Serge, you are live.
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for these wonderful presentations. I always enjoyed listening to you, and then with a short presentation, a lot of time to talk. So I'm Serge, and I'm a former AFOIA president and the credential evaluators, working mostly on the same issue about the principal focus evaluations. Indeed, theoretically, those principles work very well in theory. And then I can remember the thematic evaluation we conducted for 17 donor countries in Manila, in Philippines, in 2015. But in practice, we saw that most of the times, those principles are really not respectful, mostly from donor side. But recipients, like a country recipients or beneficiaries, maybe sometimes we are evaluators, we find like they don't have choice, just respect the principle. Especially if we look at about the party declaration you mentioned about during the discussions about the effectiveness principles, we always found like when we're evaluating high level strategic programs, those principles are just there, very well done, well developed, but in practice, the ethics and norms around those principles are not well really respected. So I wonder if you have an example at where we have an intervention with maybe where those principles have been implemented on measures. We can use the Busan Declaration, we are not yet evaluated to date, and then other international agreement ongoing. Can someone
Thank you, Serge. And you've articulated very well what amounts to a principles-focused evaluation. When you have things like the principles for evaluation, both the Joint Committee principles for evaluation that were developed, and then the OECD principles for evaluation, standards for evaluation, and part of your analysis is that these principles aren't being followed. So that is an example of a principles-focused evaluation. A major part of the report of the Paris Declaration on international development aid was addressing the OECD principles. And in the technical report of the of the Paris Declaration evaluation report, in the technical appendix, which I said was online, they actually go through each of the OECD principles for evaluation and address how they are addressing those evaluations, those principles. In addition, the Joint Committee standards for evaluation, which call for, have 5 principles: that evaluations be useful, that they be practical or feasible, that they be ethical, be accurate, and that they be accountable. Where accountable involves meta-evaluation, the Paris Declaration on International Aid Evaluation commissioned a meta-evaluation, an evaluation of the evaluation, which I conducted, which is why I know about it, to actually evaluate the extent to which the Paris Declaration evaluation adhered to evaluation principles. And my report is also available online as an evaluation of the extent to which evaluation principles were actually followed in practice. It's the best example I know of a major high-stakes evaluation engaging in evaluation of the evaluation from a principles perspective.
Great. Thank you, Serge, for asking your question live, and thank you to Michael. Our next question comes from Laura Gagliardone, who said, thank you for the outstanding presentation. And Laura's actually been lucky enough to attend some of your classes in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, and here she is now. Laura's questions, the first one, are principles sustainable, or do they develop, adapt, and change over time and or across regions and countries? And secondly, for a rule to become a principle, do you need to make people aware and make people take responsibility?
So great questions, and the extent to which principles are sustainable will depend upon the people who are adhering to them and the meaningfulness of those principles within the context where they are generated. Principles themselves are meant to be adaptable. They should be general enough that they can be adaptable. But part of evaluating principles is to actually make sure that they're communicating clearly, that they remain relevant. So the American Evaluation Association, for example, this past year has been undergoing an evaluation of the 5 guiding principles of the American Evaluation Association, and they have just come out with a revision of the principles based upon, I think it's probably been some 10 years since they've been evaluated, and have changed a couple of the principles fairly substantially, considered adding a couple of principles, and I think that ended up not happening. The Joint Committee standards for evaluation have undergone review and so added the accountability principle. So a part of evaluating principles periodically is to look at whether or not they ought to be revised to be made to continue to be relevant, to be sure the language is still appropriate, or to add principles as needed. So the American Evaluation Association a year ago added a culturally responsive principle to the repertoire for evaluators as something that was missing as guidance for evaluators, a cultural competence principle. So they do develop over time as we get experience with them. That's part of what a principles-focused evaluation contributes, is the opportunity for revision. The moving of rules to principles does require some, I think, to be effective, buy-in and people to share an understanding of why that change would take place. Sometimes rules turn out to be inappropriate. I was working with the railroads in the United States, and they have a group of people that is made up of representative railroad companies and railroad employees and government regulators and the general public that do major reviews every time there's a fatality on the railroads. One subgroup of those people examine fatalities in switching yards. Switching yards is where trains come together and the cars get moved around and filled up and then move on to back on the tracks of their destinations. And there's a lot of action there. And there are fatalities. 20, 30 people a year die in switching yard accidents. One of the rules that have been formulated to try to save lives was that at a certain level in the middle part of the United States, cutting through Ohio, Illinois, the middle part of the country, that after the 1st of November, that workers in switching yards had to wear cleats, shoes with cleats on them, in order to be able to run, be safe on ice and snow. And there was a fatality where a person wearing cleats going alongside a moving train to wait for it to slow down and uncouple it, fell and fell under the train and was killed because he was wearing cleats at a time when there was no snow and ice. So the whole idea of formulating a rule that says at a certain date you start wearing cleats, when in fact the principle is, the guidance ought to be, wear the appropriate apparel for weather conditions. You don't wear cleats if there's no ice and snow. Cleats are dangerous on gravel. And so that's a movement from a rule to a principle where you evaluate the effects of the rule and say the rule is overly rigid, the rule is overly constrained. What we need is a principle that calls for people to think and use judgment. And that's the way that you move rules to principles, is to evaluate both rules and principles and what each one does.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Laura, for your questions. The next question comes from Julia Friedson. And Julia discusses the blue marble approach, which includes, is it global, is it cross-sectoral, and are there global local interactions? Julia asks, can you give some examples of the questions you use to test each of these?
Thank you. It's actually amazingly simple to look at what an international initiative is doing and see if it's truly global in its approach, or if it simply says that it's global and it's only working in a few places. So the questions involved for the global targeting is the initiative operating with a global sense of the interconnections across nation states and across entities, instead of, for example, the SDGs themselves are all nation state based. The SDGs are not a global accountability system, they're national accountability system. And so part of the blue marble principles is to say that's fine for nation states to have indicators and be held accountable for their piece in the SDGs, but in fact, at a global level, the much of the problems that we experience can't be solved at a nation-state level, and so global initiatives are actually ones where when you examine the work, you examine what's getting done, what the scopes of work is, what the nature of the initiatives are working at a truly cross-nation level, cross-silo level, and are integrating local and global concerns. So it's I think that when you actually look at scopes of work, when you actually interview people, when you look at their plans, when you look at the nature of what they're doing, it's pretty easy to tell the extent to which they're taking a blue marble perspective versus the extent to which they are operating within the confines of nation states, silos, and a top-down approach. So the questions you're asking is basically what do the actual operations look like, and to what extent do they reflect blue marble principles versus these more traditional accountability ways of working?
Great, thank you, Michael. The next question comes from Inta Sinite, and Inta asks, it seems principle-based evaluation is applied at the macro level. Can it be introduced at the micro level for evaluations of specific programs which have quite narrow outcomes?
Absolutely. In fact, I only used macro examples because of the audience, an international and global kind of audience. But the examples, most of the examples in the book are more micro examples. One example is that's a beautiful example, and the report is available online, is evaluation of programs in Minneapolis and St. Paul, here where I'm coming from, for youth homelessness. And 6 small agencies, each of which serve about 30 homeless youth a night, collaborated on a principles-focused evaluation. They identified 8 principles that guide their work across agencies. So one way in which principles serve is as a basis for collaboration of projects, programs, and agencies that are each doing their own thing, delivering different services to different target populations, but are sharing what brings them together is a common set of principles. And these 6 agencies collaborated to take a sample of their participants who we interviewed to find out from the participant perspective to what extent these principles were actually being implemented in practice. And the resulting report is available online. If you Google 9, let me think of the name of it, 9 effectiveness principles for helping youth overcome homelessness. 9 effectiveness principles for helping youth overcome homelessness. You will find this report that outlines the principles, how they were evaluated, and how they are being used. There's also a chapter in the book about that particular example. That's at the very grassroots, very micro level.
Great, thank you, Inta, for your question. Thank you, Michael, for the detailed answer. The next question comes from Michael Moses. Michael asks, can you please unpack the difference between developmental evaluation and principles-focused evaluation? To me, the process of doing a principles-focused evaluation would seem most effective if it applies a developmental evaluation approach, and would mostly be about helping partners articulate, implement, and monitor the efficacy of their own principles-focused practice. What am I missing?
Certainly, my own appreciation of principles, one of the things I discuss in the book is how the attention to principles flowed from developmental evaluation, because in innovators, which developmental evaluation is aimed at, innovators are often principles driven rather than having logic models or SMART goals. And so there are forms of developmental evaluation that are very principles based, including the difference between scaling principles and scaling practices is quite dramatic. But because developmental evaluation is a purpose distinction, summative, formative, developmental, accountability, these are different purposes of evaluation. Principles is a different focus of evaluation. We can evaluate policies, strategies, projects, programs, principles. And so you can do any purpose of evaluation on principles. A summative evaluation of principles is whether or not you have the right principles or whether or not they're being followed. So in fact, the evaluation of the Paris Declaration on International Aid ended up being a summative evaluation that found that for the most part, the world was not adhering to the principles. That evaluation was not developmental at all. It was aimed at assessing the extent to which the principles are actually being implemented. A formative evaluation of principles would be to help, and for example, these youth homelessness programs I referred to, they've used the results of the principles-focused evaluation to do staff training on principles, to improve understanding of principles. They're not developing their principles. They are improving staff understanding, board understanding, using the principles for fundraising. They're doing formative evaluation. And accountability a focus for principles-focused evaluation would look entirely at compliance. If a funding agency funded certain principles, did people actually follow the principles in their actions? Developmental evaluation with principles is very much as you described it. It's helping people develop on the basis of principles, but those are purpose distinctions, any one of which could be applied to principles.
Thank you, Michael, for the detailed differentiation there. I think we're just going to take one more question before we wrap up today's discussion, and this comes from Itim, but also from a number of members of the audience who have asked something similar regarding principles are sometimes a part of the program. They often define what the program sort of is trying to implement, and are we evaluating the principles as they relate to program effectiveness or impact?
Absolutely. Because if the principles are meaningful and they are being adhered to, uh, the principles, one of the criteria for a principle is that it points toward desired results. And so the when you look at principles like nonviolence, um, the desired result of that was to overturn colonialism. Um, in the civil rights movement in the United States, it was over and still is to overturn racial injustice. Um, so the, the difference is that a movement is not made up of particular projects and programs. It's a movement directed at some major change. And so the youth homelessness principles evaluation you will find is directed at helping youth overcome homelessness. And what they found is that the principles, working according to those principles, is more instructive because they're adaptable, they're customized to the needs of individual youth, that following those principles has greater success in helping youth overcome homelessness than some standardized model that would suggest you do the same thing with each youth. So the very adaptability of the principles. Finally, an example of the evaluation principles. The overarching evaluation principle for both the OECD standards and for the Joint Committee standards that have been adopted by the African Evaluation Association, the American Evaluation Association, the Canadian Evaluation Society. Those principles all call for judging evaluations by their utility. The outcome of the principles is to be useful evaluations. That can be evaluated. Are evaluations used? Are they in serving the purposes of intended use by intended users? So the principle of focusing on utility is judged by whether or not utility results. That's an outcome. Principles are very much, as I said earlier, not just process oriented, but outcomes focused.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael, for the detailed answers to every question today, as well as the fantastic presentation. We really enjoyed having you sort of be a part of the M&E Thursday Talks, and it was great to have you online. And thank you to the 150 people around the world that joined today's discussion live. And the recording will be posted on the DME for Peace website through our media gallery later today. So please return to it, share it with your colleagues, and continue the discussion online in the comments. I'm going to use this opportunity to make one more quick plug for DME for Peace. As most of you know, DME for Peace is an open source knowledge platform for the monitoring and evaluation, development, peace building, and humanitarian communities. Not only are we trying to develop an evidence base for what works, what doesn't, and why in these communities, we are trying to fulfill a resource deficit so that practitioners in the field can access evaluation resources and reports wherever they are in the world, and help sort of break down those barriers of accessibility to monitoring and evaluation. So if you go to your chat box right now and go to webinar, there's a link where you can upload your resources directly to DME for Peace. Everything is open source and crowdsourced on the website. So we really hope to sort of continue to build our resource library on the 1,200 resources we have right now. Once more, thank you very much, Michael. It was absolutely wonderful to have you host. We're going to be back on April 19th with social impact to discuss developmental evaluation and the work of the developmental evaluation monitoring and evaluation research learning program run out of USAID, and we hope to see you online again soon. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your week, and thanks again to Michael.